So my name is Sandy. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in social psychology here at the University of Oxford. And my research focuses primarily on how the internet shapes processes of social change. So I study the impact of social media on collective action and civic participation. I also study dynamics of trust in online communities. And I recently started a line of work in Northern Ireland about how we can use internet-based platforms for conflict resolution initiatives. And I'll be presenting today some of the work that I did with my colleague Anastasia.
And I'm Anastasia Cavada. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. I'm in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, so a different sort of approach to Sundays. My work is on social movements, non-governmental organizations, and their use of the internet. So my latest project was actually on the Occupy movement, and it was based on interviews. So I have interviews with nearly 80 people, looking at digital practices and online content. But I've done work on the global justice movement, Amnesty, Avaaz, sort of organizations like that as well. So what we will be presenting to you here is our research that we conducted on Greenpeace social media followers and people using the internet to engage with Greenpeace online. So just by way of, and we're hoping that this will lead to sort of like a broader discussion around how we study and how we define online engagement. Which I think, sort of like attending some of the sessions here, I think it's sort of like a theme and an issue that is on people's minds, right? So I have a question for you just before we start. And we have microphones and this is a lecture theater, so it's not a very interactive setting. But please do raise your hands and we'll bring a microphone to you if you want to sort of like ask a question as we go along, and if you have a comment, please don't hesitate. I know that this is an intimidating setting for that, but please do. So my question is, how do you study online engagement? So all of you, I guess, use metrics. So how many of you use metrics, sort of like social media metrics to do that? Okay. So how many of you are using surveys of your supporters? Surveys, questionnaires? Okay, fewer people. How many of you are doing interviews, so more qualitative work? Focus groups? 2? Okay. That's interesting. Methods like ethnography or participant observation, somebody following and observing what your supporters are doing? Okay, that's not a prominent method. Okay, so that is interesting just to see a little bit, what are the methods that we are using. So first I'd like to start by a very simple thing, sort of like thinking about civic participation. As academics, of course, we need to define our terms. I'm giving you a very simple definition. That civic participation refers to behaviors, and these behaviors can include retrieving and processing information, expressing your opinion and interacting about a specific issue, but also taking action. So goal-directed activities to advance certain opinions, your own opinions or the opinion of the group in which you belong. And we will see later the fact that, so in the literature, what we see is that we have sort of like very distinct definitions. So we have 3 types of behavior, but what our research actually shows is that some of these behaviors, depending on the platform, are actually undertaken together. So, it's interesting like how we define it. And the taking action part actually leads to one of the debates. I know I was on Twitter yesterday and people were saying, I think that we should stop using clicktivism as a term, and I added, well, maybe we should stop using slacktivism as well, right? And this is a quote from Seth Meyers from Saturday Night Live, which says, look, if you make a Facebook page, we will like it. It's the least we can do, but it's also the most we can do. And that's something we want to challenge. So of course, I said, against slacktivism. I'm using slacktivism in the slides. But there is this debate around whether taking action online actually means that people maintain a very low commitment to the organization. It does not really have a lot of impact. And it may actually undermine future engagement because people are like, I did my bit, I signed this online petition, I don't really need to participate in anything else, right? So there is this thing that seems to be debated both by practitioners and by academics. But what I think that we're missing here is the evidence. So there's a lot of speculation in the literature, and some of the people that I mentioned before, that like Morozov or Gladwell, these are people who are not basing their work on sort of like research that they have done. And this is something that we are trying to sort of like actually address here, right? So what seems to be missing in current research, first of all, there's a lot of work on organizations and what organizations do, but there is less work from the user perspective. So how do the users feel? You know, are they committed? What sort of things are they doing on those platforms? The other thing that I think seems to be missing is that people either focus on the internet in general when they're doing surveys, or they focus on a very specific platform. So they're looking at Twitter, or they're looking at Facebook. So this multi-platform aspect also is missing. And the third thing is that you people either seem to have access to the social media metrics and do a lot of things with that. And I think that's the case both on the academic side and the practitioner side. But what we're lacking is sort of like combining them with more information about user engagement and attitudes and opinions and information about their identification and commitment and all that. So these are certain things that we think are missing. So what are our research questions here? First of all, we try to think about what types of online civic participation are undertaken on different social media platforms and internet services. How committed are the users undertaking these different types of actions? And are practices of online civic participation platform specific, or can similar patterns be identified across platforms and services? So I give the mic to Sandy, who can talk about this. But do you have any questions so far? No? Fine, okay.
All right, so in order to respond to those research questions, we developed an online survey, the other way, together with Greenpeace International. And we piloted the survey, and it was launched in the beginning of 2013. So you see, academic research takes a little bit longer. But by now, we managed to analyze all our results in real detail, so hopefully the delay makes up for that. In the survey, we assessed primarily respondents' practices of civic engagement on Greenpeace websites, email lists, on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and on respondents' personal blogs and emails. We also assessed a number of control variables such as demographics and, as Anastasia mentioned, motivations and attitudes. And I'll go into more detail as we come to the results. The survey was sent out by Greenpeace International through their Facebook and Twitter accounts, and we will talk about how that impacted our results or limited our results a little bit later on. So who were our respondents? We were able to use data from 620 self-defined Greenpeace supporters. So they were not necessarily formal members, of course, but they all agreed on the fact that they support Greenpeace and their goals and activities. It was a pretty diverse sample, as you may see, and well, for me, quite exciting, 65% female, because usually in social psychology, we only study women. Very few men come to our experiments, so that was a pretty good data set here. Also, we see that some of the respondents might have just started to support Greenpeace, might have just been involved for a few months, while others could be defined as long-term supporters. Right, I'm now going to come to the results, and I'll try to keep it as non-technical as possible, and I'll talk about statistics, of course, because that's important. If you have any questions, if anything is confusing, please let me know right away, because, yes. Yeah.
By some the respondents.
So yeah.
Were they respondents self-selected or?
Exactly. So it was a convenience sample, basically, just sending out the link, and whoever wanted to respond, responded. And we only, that's why I mentioned that we were able to use data from 620. Obviously, there were a lot more that started the questionnaire. We only used fully completed questionnaires. And I also deleted around 32, where it was pretty clear that they had just clicked through and not, actually responded to the items. So, but yes, it was a convenience sample. Right, so the results, I will present them in 3 blocks. And the first step we looked at, well, the descriptives in a way. So what facets of civic engagement can we identify on different platforms? So first of all, here are some average platform use. So what we did is we basically computed means across different digital practices that we assessed on each platform. And what you see here is that the email list is clearly very popular with our respondents. So they use the email list on a scale from never to daily, at least once a week, to learn about Greenpeace or to engage with the organization. The website as well is doing quite well, so the website is used multiple times a month. Facebook as well, used on average multiple times a month, although for Facebook and Twitter, we need to keep in mind that the survey was sent out through those 2 social media platforms. So per definition, all of the respondents used those platforms, which means that the scores are probably inflated. So we have to be cautious about the results here. You also see that personal blog, email, and YouTube are rarely used. And we actually decided to set a cutoff and set a cutoff at 2, an average use of 2, which refers to using a platform only once a month. Because we thought if I use a platform only once a month or even less, it's very difficult to judge what I do on this platform. It's already very difficult to judge that retrospectively, but in particular difficult if I don't use a platform frequently. So with this in mind, we actually decided to continue our analysis only with 4 platforms, being the website, email lists, Facebook, and Twitter. And again, for Twitter, it's actually quite marginal, but we included it just to see what's going on there, basically. So in the next step, we wanted to identify distinct facets of civic engagement on each platform. And Anastasia presented on the first slide sort of practices that are defined in the literature, like accessing information, discussing opinions, and taking goal-directed actions. So we wanted to see whether we can replicate these theoretical frameworks. And we used statistical analysis. It's called principal component analysis. I don't go into detail. If anyone wants to know, we can have a chat later on. But basically, it allows us to explore data, and it allows us to identify independent factors of behavior that are represented by very distinct actions. I hope that makes more sense now once I show you the results. So this is the result for the website. What you see in the lower part of the table are the distinct practices that we assessed. And for those, our respondents indicated how frequently they performed them. Originally, those were 8. Now, here you see 7. Those were 8. We had also included making donations on the website. However, in the statistical analysis, this item didn't load sufficiently high to make any sound conclusions. So I'm not reporting this because, yeah, I'm not really confident about where to put, basically, this making donations. But for those 7 practices, we were able to identify 3 factors that are independent and that are each represented by the very distinct behavior that you see there. So just going to walk you through the result a bit. The labels on the top are obviously our interpretation, and so they are open for discussion as well. We try to be as descriptive as possible and to not evaluate at this step what those factors mean. So on the very far right, we see 3 individual practices that refer to behavior of entertainment use or accessing visual content. The second factor being an interpersonal interaction, so commenting on blog posts. And the first factor is actually the most interesting one. First of all, it's behavior that's most frequently performed on the website, and entailing such actions, such gathering information, signing petitions, and sharing material onto other social media platforms. And it's also a factor that is consistent across all the platforms we assess. So keep this in mind as I walk you through the other slides, because it will reappear. Before I move on, I just want to ask you whether this sort of analysis and the outcome makes sense for everyone, because there will be 3 more slides like this, so if you're confused now, it's just gonna continue. Yeah, everyone more or less on board, okay. So let's move on to the Facebook page. So we also did this analysis for respondents' personal Facebook profile, but the results are exactly the same. So I'm just gonna present the results of the Facebook page. Here, of course, we included different digital practices on which our respondents reported how frequently they performed them. And those could be identified as 5 independent factors. And we see some familiar factors here. So again, factor 1, the one that's also the most frequent behavior on the Facebook page, includes again such practices such as accessing information, signing petitions, and more symbolic or expressive civic actions, such as liking Facebook posts by Greenpeace, for instance. Again, we see a factor of interaction, here also including practices of interacting with fellow supporters, and a factor of entertainment / accessing visual content. What I found quite interesting here is that sharing actually emerges as an independent factor. On the website and also Facebook, practices of sharing material or retweeting material actually are included in our famous first factor. So they seem to be understood as similar as accessing information or signing a petition. On Facebook, it's an independent behavior, and we believe that it's probably due to the fact that the feature of sharing is so much more prominent on Facebook. And that's a bit of a off-topic comment now, but what we see from this result is that when we study civic engagement online, it's not only important to look across different platforms, but it's also important to take the affordances and features of those platforms into account, because they clearly shape the patterns and the structure of engagement. All right, let's move on to Twitter. It's a bit easier here. So we're only able to identify 2 factors. The first one, again, looking very similar to what we identified on the website and Facebook. It's again the most frequent behavior, including practices of information access, sharing, and signing petitions. And factor 2, more or less referring to practices of interaction with fellow supporters and/or Greenpeace representatives. And last but not least, the email list. We only assessed actually 3 practices here. We thought this would be the main activities that you could do if you're signed up on the email list. And they all load or are represented by 1 factor, so they all refer to 1 type of behavior. Again, looking very similar to what we identified on website, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, so this was the first step of our analysis, showing, as Anastasia had already mentioned, that a clear distinction of civic engagement in only 3 practices is clearly not what we can replicate in the data. So it's probably much more complex, as all of you know or expected, I suppose. All right, so with this in mind, we then thought, right, so we can use our information about user behavior with actual insights about users. So we asked them, as I mentioned, about their identification with Greenpeace, about their support of their tactics, about their efficacy beliefs, and also about environmental interests or concern. And as you see, all the scores are very high, so our sample was very committed to Greenpeace, which is obviously an optimistic message for the organization. For us, it was a little bit difficult because you see that it's, well, probably quite some ceiling effects here, which makes statistical analysis complicated, but that's all right. So we moved on from here, and we wanted to understand whether those attitudes and motivations towards Greenpeace affect in any way what the respondents did online. And so I ran multiple regressions with the different facets of civic engagement, and we see always the same pattern. Basically, all the facets of online civic engagement that you just saw, they're all positively related to commitment. So the more committed our respondents are, the more likely they are to perform these different forms of behavior, which sounds intuitively, but keep in mind there were some facets that we considered maybe as entertainment use, or our famous factor one might be actually some form of behavior that could be belittled as slacktivism by our friends Malcolm Gladwell, etc. And so here we do see a positive relationship, which I think is actually quite promising. The error goes in both ways because obviously we cannot draw any causal conclusions. So we're not sure whether as people engage in more civic actions online, they become more committed, or whether it goes the other way around. So we need more data to draw that conclusion. We also looked at a little bit of a, bonus question here. It was not our original research question, but we had asked our participants how willing they would be to continue to stay involved with Greenpeace and to get engaged in actions offline. And there was a range of activities that we proposed involving anything from putting up a poster in your front yard to actually going to a local chapter meeting to sailing aboard a Greenpeace ship. And across all these different dependent variables or possible forms of offline engagement, we see again a positive relationship so that those respondents who engaged in more civic actions online were then also more willing to continue to be involved. The error goes again both ways because we're not sure whether being already engaged offline drives offline activism or vice versa. But overall, it's an optimistic picture because one of the slacktivism critiques obviously being that online actions undermine offline engagement, we are able to contest that with our data. Right, so that was step 2 of the results. We're now going to come to the last part, which I think is the most exciting, because we sort of went beyond what has been already done in previous research and what is sort of discussed in the literature, and we looked at multi-platform use. What we meant by that is that basically we know for each respondent how many social media platforms or internet services they used. And we looked at relations between the use of those platforms. So just descriptives here, the majority of our respondents used 3 to 4 platforms. And again, there's a positive correlation with commitment. So the more committed our respondents are, the more platforms they use to learn about Greenpeace and to engage and interact with Greenpeace. If they use free platforms, it's the email list, Facebook, and website, so that's not really a surprise, considering that those were also the most frequently used platforms overall. If they use 4 platforms, Twitter as well as personal email become rather relevant. Rather relevant only because if you keep in mind an average of 2 means once a month, so we shouldn't get too excited here. Yes? Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. I was just wondering, did you map this against the efforts that Greenpeace were making across the different platforms? So if they were investing most of their activity on Twitter, did you see any kind of relationship between them?
Yeah, no, we didn't. So we didn't map that actually. It's a very interesting question. We didn't map that against what actually happened on the social media channels. Was that your question? Yeah, that would be very exciting actually, and possibly something we could actually follow up with. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So this is just actually all of those findings are based on users' perceptions. And so, it's not metrics, so it's not even objective behavior in that sense. It's just what users perceived they did. And we make the point that it's actually much more important than objective behavior. Well, the whole discipline of social psychology is actually built on that because we believe that what you perceive you do or what you perceive is important for you shapes your behavior much more. But in general, this is something to keep in mind as we look at that. Yeah. All right. So this is my favorite slide, and it's maybe not immediately clear why. But basically what we did then as a final step is we looked at whether using more platforms to learn about Greenpeace and to engage with Greenpeace shapes how you act on each platform. Okay, I will explain it in several ways, and hopefully in the end it makes sense. But basically what we can show is that controlling for a whole lot of demographic variables, as well as controlling for the commitment that respondents hold towards Greenpeace, the more platforms they use, the more frequently they use the email list, Facebook, and the website for information access. So it's not just that because they are more committed that they are suddenly starting to use more platforms and thereby engaging more with the organization, but actually as they use more platforms, their engagement on the individual platform becomes more frequent. And I found that exciting because it's theoretically quite interesting, but I'm not sure how that translates to your work. And I think I'm going to pass on now to Anastasia, who will try to summarize those results and hopefully give you some meaningful conclusions that you can take home with.
Do you have any questions so far? No? Fine? Okay. So 3 slides to go. Oh, okay, sorry. So in terms of conclusions, what we managed to show is that we can see sort of like distinct facets of behavior on different platforms, but this seems to be platform specific. So taking into account the specific characteristics and features of the platforms are important in terms of understanding civic engagement and distinct sort of like types of behavior. And also types of behavior that, at least in the literature, we tend to think of them as distinct: accessing information, signing petitions. They load on the same factor in our analysis. So I think it's interesting. When it comes to multi-platform use, what we see is that the more platforms people use, then the use of the functions of the platform starts to differ. Facebook is used for every function, while the website and the email list are used for accessing information and signing petitions. And particularly the website seems to become a hub for that, which I guess, sort of like maybe, I'm not sure whether it fits in with your experience of multi-platform sort of like strategies that you have. Now, civic actions that require less time, such as information accessing and sharing and signing petitions. We don't want to use the term clicktivism, slacktivism here, or even low-cost actions, because we're making sort of like value judgments, and we sort of like try to avoid doing that. So we need new terms, and if anybody thinks of a new term, please let us know, and it's something maybe that we can sort of discuss further later on. These are more likely to be performed by the more highly committed, and they are also related to engagement offline, which in a way contests the whole slacktivism thesis. This is what we found. We also found that demographic characteristics do not seem to play a role, because for every analysis that we did, we were controlling for demographic characteristics. And I think this raises very interesting questions, because from the discussions that we have here, I know that when it comes to audience segmentation, you are doing a lot on it based on demographic characteristics. We didn't find any, for them to be playing a role. Rather, it was the user's commitment that seems to be driving engagement. So those results were quite interesting. And the limitations that Sandy was mentioning as she was going along, we want to be sort of like really transparent, obviously. It's self-reported data. So of course, what we are reporting here are people's perceptions. And also this is based on their recall, like what they remember doing. So this is quite important. And I think it would be interesting to then compare it and contrast it with the metrics that you have on actual behavior, just to see whether people are perceiving, for instance, to be using email much more than they actually do, because they use email for other stuff. So they think they use email for Greenpeace much more. So it would be sort of like interesting to see how perceptions tally up with sort of like actual behavior. The other thing is that we cannot prove causality. So we know that there is a relationship, a correlation, but we cannot show the direction of, the direction of the relationship. We need more data to actually do that. The survey was circulated on Facebook and Twitter, so those sort of like, the results might be overreported, and the sample might be self-selected, right? So maybe we have sort of like people who are more committed here. And it was a long questionnaire. We asked them a lot of questions. So, again, we have people who are more committed. So with that in mind, we're not saying that this is perfect. And, from our discussions here, 620 people, it's nothing related to sort of like the metrics that you have and the numbers that you have. Any questions? We actually had some questions for discussion, just to stimulate discussion further. what are your common practices, something that I mentioned earlier, how we can combine metrics and data, and how can we think also of qualitative methods, because survey is also a quantitative method. You use metrics which are quantitative, so we use a lot of numbers, but not qualitative data coming from interviews and focus groups, and how we can sort of like combine that. So these are the questions that we had, but maybe your concerns are completely different. So any questions? Yes. Okay.
Sorry, me again. Just wondering, how did you gauge how committed people said they were? I mean, because it's such a broad statement, so how did you kind of try and get that to be an objective measurement?
So it's not an objective measurement, to say that. So basically, we created a mean across 3 items, the ones that I presented earlier. So because they all correlated highly, and they actually all represented one behavior that we don't refer to as commitment, and that it's the identification with the organization, and that's a very literal item, just asking, I identify with Greenpeace, and then they rated that on a scale from 1 to 7. Then the other item was about how much do you approve Greenpeace tactics, and how efficacious do you believe that the organization is in achieving its goal. So, and as I mentioned, then basically just a mean across those. And it's not objective, it's how much they perceive themselves to be committed. But I think actually, and so most of the research in collective action, for instance, works with those measures, and they seem to be very, very good predictors of outcome. And so, yeah.
I've got 2 questions actually. The first one is, do you think this means that the more platforms a supporter engages with a charity across, so Facebook, Twitter, email, etc., the more likely they are to take committed actions like donating and putting in regular donations and campaign actions and so on, and therefore, I'm sure there's lots of qualifications on that from the look on your face, and therefore, for example, if a charity does a petition by email and they have just an email address, there's a business case then for getting them to like you on Facebook, to follow on Twitter, to read articles on the website, because it increases how many platforms they interact with you on. So is there a business case, therefore, for getting them on other platforms? I forgot my other question, so I'm sure I'll remember while you answer this one.
Okay, yeah. So I'd like to say yes. Unfortunately, we assessed making donations both on the website and on Facebook. Unfortunately, on the website, the frequency was so low that we couldn't include it in the analysis. Now on the Facebook page, can I go back? Can you click back? There's actually, one factor that emerges that we refer to as more committed actions. It's the last one, and that includes making donations and, it's, of course, I don't know if this is what you mean when you think about more committed actions, but it's the closest we could get, at least. And so here, yes, indeed, we do see that they are more likely to engage in those actions as they act on more platforms. So, yeah.
The other question was, where they do similar things on different platforms, so use the platform to consume information about a charity, was there any way of them expressing a preference for which channel they like to do that on? So, for example, learn about Facebook's latest campaigns. Do they prefer to do that on Twitter, on Facebook, on website? Was there any information on that?
That's a very good question. That would be very easy to look into. I can actually do that right now after. We didn't look into that, but just obviously looking at the general preference of platforms, it's possible that the email list will emerge. But if you want to, I can run the analysis quickly after the talk.
Sure.
Yeah.
Other questions? Everything's clear?
Maybe.
I was just wondering, are the conclusions what you expected to see, or are they different from what you anticipated before doing the study?
Maybe I should take this. So I'm not really a survey person. That's why Sandy presented those results. So, I mean, I didn't expect the distinct behaviors on Facebook, but then when you saw them, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I think it's quite interesting, for example, that sharing emerges as a different, thing. The fact that people who use multiple platforms tend to be more committed, yeah, that, for instance, we did expect. But yes, I mean, it's interesting when actually, results like that emerge, because this is not really what you see in the literature. But what I would like to actually throw that question back at you. I mean, did anything surprise you in those results? So did that fit your experience? Did you find anything surprising? Huh?
Could you go back to the results slide?
Okay, which one? I don't know. So we identified distinct behaviors, for instance, on different platforms. Did that make sense to you? I mean, is that what you see people doing when it comes to looking at the metrics, for instance? Yeah? Or no idea?
Well, signing petitions can also be off of your website.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, it maybe challenges some perceptions about people currently using Facebook to get people to sign petitions and actions, and I know certainly we use that quite a lot, and we don't see a huge amount of take-up, so maybe that's, driving home some points of just things that we're seeing that maybe it's more effective if we're, for interaction and sharing rather than getting people to sign petitions, which I think is probably what a lot of us do, is try to get people to sign petitions through Facebook.
And the interesting thing is that the more they use those kinds of platforms, Facebook emerges as a site of interaction, while the website is the hub for signing petitions and the email lists. Anything else that you maybe found surprising, or you thought, yeah, that's right, or not surprising at all? No? I'm sorry, something was fiddly without my microphone. We're filming, so we need to use the microphone, and that makes the whole interaction really hard. Yeah, so can we go back to the discussion and the questions? Yeah. Yeah. So we asked you about that and the problems and limitations. So another question that I had for you is that, do you measure multi-platform engagement? So can you sort of follow one person and see what sort of things they do on different platforms, like we were able to do? No. Would that data be interesting for you? Yes. Okay. Good. You know where we are. Yes. Okay. Yes.
I just had a question about future research, and obviously this is a survey, and really it's quite low respondents in comparison to the number of people in these spaces. So the level to which it could actually be considered to be significant when not kind of cross-analysed against other data is sort of, I suppose, kind of limited. So but it's a really interesting kind of first sort of scoping and thinking about whether it's worth pursuing. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how you might take this research forward, and if you had any plans to do any other kinds of, so you were saying you don't like surveys, are you going to try and do some follow-up interviews with some of the people that filled in the surveys, etc.? Yeah. And it'd be really useful to have that information.
Yeah. So first of all, we have some comments to the survey that we haven't really analyzed. Some of the comments are like, this was really long, so you have to do something about it. But there were some comments that were more interesting than that. But yes, I'd love to do a follow-up on this. And it would be nice to see what happens with other organizations, so to be able to compare and contrast. And if you do it more in collaboration, so we need to thank Martin Lloyd, who was in Greenpeace International then. Now I know that he's in Greenpeace Netherlands, from what I've heard. So he was really nice, sort of like tweeting and putting that on Facebook. But you know from running your own surveys, if you ever did that, you need to sort of like do repeat emails to people in order to get a higher response rate. So that that would be something I guess that both Sandy and I would be interested in doing. So this was the first foray into the field to see what people are doing and how they're feeling about it, because we were sort of like bored of the whole Slacktivism and collectivism thing, and you're like, yeah, yes.
Sorry if this has been asked already, but did you, the reason I want to justify the use of social media in my organisation, and I could justify it by demonstrating that it has an uplift on things like donations and actually taking actions. Did you see it in any of the research that people who take more social actions are more likely to do the things that are perceived as more valuable by the organisation, like donations and petitions?
In terms of making donations online, actually, we did see a relation between using the website as a source of information and making more donations. So considering all the different facets as predictors of making donations online, that emerged as a significant predictor. However, it was a very low relation, and also making donations online in general was not very frequent. So it doesn't, it's not, I remember when we sent a report to Morten, I flagged it up as something that might be interesting. But in terms of, the stats, it's not a very powerful result that you should base your strategy on at all. So, and I think what is more interesting is to see the relation between the online and the offline engagement. It's something that I studied quite a bit, also during my PhD, because there were obviously, there's a lot of critique that, only acting online, that's going to be enough, and then no one moves on offline. So I think that relatively strong and positive correlation, that's actually the most promising that we can take from that work. And yeah, but this relation goes across all facets of, so actually you don't even need to sign a petition to then be more willing to act offline already. Just getting informed about the organization is actually a very strong predictor of then wanting to get engaged. So, yeah.
I think we probably need to do more qualitative research and then come back with another survey. So particularly with the donations, my sense is that, that's one of the big issues. And perhaps I think my thinking is like brainstorming here. We need to get maybe people doing focus groups, see what makes them donate, and then go back and do sort of like a survey in order to sort of like establish their relationships. Because it seems to me that it's a bit of a black box here.
I was just going to ask, from the results that you've had, how are you going to implement any changes going forward to your strategy at Greenpeace for your digital communications?
So who's here from Greenpeace? I would like to answer that. Thetis? No. Thetis didn't know about this research until yesterday. So I think that's the other thing maybe with academia. And so we ran this research in 2013, and now it's 2015 when, we had the time to actually, it's also the funding aspect, sort of like finding our time to actually do that. So we do that mostly on our free time. So I think that's another issue. But yes, I think, we need to work together much more. That's I think, the issue here for me. We have different agendas, but I think we can communicate and help each other, So for me, that's the takeaway here. Yeah, more research to be done. Yes, he did.
He didn't say how they changed their strategy. Yeah. Yeah, so, I know that, they work with a lot of consultancies and so on. They all provide a lot of data and information. And what you said on collaborating more between academics and practitioners, I think it's very important, because looking back at the results of the report that I sent to Martin, obviously that was a very academic analysis. I was in my third year as a PhD student, and I was writing as my supervisor told me to write up results, but I'm not even sure whether anything, or whether Martin could take anything from that. And so I think maybe as a conclusion it would be really great to have more dialogue and to also learn what is important for you guys, because we can do kind of a lot, basically, but often it's just based on our theoretical interests, and that may not be what you're looking for. So yeah, right.
So yes,
yes.
I'm going to round up. That's my exercise for the week.
Thanks. Just out of interest, what are your thoughts on doing qualitative research on in terms of committed actions, and actually analysing how much social change that does actually make? So, for example, maybe some people could say that actually the selectivism still is valid because the actions that are being taken are at a certain level, but actually is it really affecting change? So the type of people you're getting are taking action, but ultimately is that action really changing stuff that those people take? So yeah, have you got any thoughts on that, or yeah, qualitative?
For me, okay, so you can do interviews, but for me, focus groups might be more interesting here, because with focus groups you get more data from how people interact with each other and discussing with each other. You could get sort of like focus groups of people who you don't consider to be very committed, people who mainly contribute online, and see what they say. People who seem to be offline activists and supporters, and see what they say, what their motivations are, what it is that they're getting. You can have control groups where you mix people together, online and offline, for example. And there, I think you can get some interesting data from the interaction between people, so that when they talk about their engagement, their perception of how efficient and how much sort of like it's bringing social change. So I would start from that, and then maybe think about survey questions and roll it out to your supporters as a survey. So this is what I would do personally. But, any other? I have a question for you. So if you had a wish list of like research that you would like to do when it comes to online engagement, what would be on that wish list? Yeah.
It's related to my question, actually. It's something I'd want to do in my organisation, is find a way to cross-reference people who follow us on social media with our supporter base, and work out whether our supporters who do follow us are higher value. So do they give more donations because they follow us on social media, or do they take more campaigning actions because they follow us on social? Because that would prove my life was worth, really. So.
But that's difficult to do unless you get people to give you that data, right? Because they may have different names on social media. I mean, how can you cross-reference that? It's just, there are programs.
Social CRM should be able to pull in data from Facebook and Twitter based on the email address, assuming that's the main email address for the account, obviously. But yeah, there's big expensive social CRM platforms out there, HubSpot and stuff like that will measure all of that stuff, but cost you.
Yeah, so it would be good to do that across organizations. So there is maybe a case for sharing data here, which I know that nobody wants to do probably, but it might be interesting. Anything else on your wish list? What else would you like to research? What's sort of like, what are the burning questions when it comes to research? Yeah.
I think it goes back to the point that he was making at the back earlier, is doing that thing of connecting what you're getting people to do online with the actual with campaigning impact. It's a constant struggle, and so actually being able to assess that, like, what does it mean once you've engaged people online? Does it actually have any impact in the real world on the issue you're campaigning on, or not?
I think this is something you can only do if you're actually asking people to provide this data, which is how many people take online discussions that have started from your campaign and take them offline. How many of them discuss it at home with friends and family? I think that would be really useful to know.
Yeah. So the online.
Yeah, very much a related point. It would be interesting to know not only how much interaction online results in campaign actions, but also whether or not it results in behaviour change, or whether people feel that they change their behaviour based on how much they're interacting online.
So the online, offline versus
It'd be interesting to know exactly what content makes people want to donate. You know, regardless of what platform it goes out on. If you donated, what made you want to? And then, crucially, for the majority, and it still is a majority that don't donate, why not? You know, what stops you? They may not be aware of it, but you know that's the kind of thing that would shape your content across all platforms.
That is interesting, and I think you can ask that also in a focus group of people who are donors and how they donate, you know, because sometimes it may be that it's the organization asking you to donate, and it's easier if a friend asks you to donate, right? So it might have to do with the opportunities, who asks you, you know, all kinds of sort of like things that you may not be taking into account. Wish list. We're going to take that down and probably send it to you. So this is your wish list. Let's now sort of like do research on stuff. So there might be a practical outcome out of that. Anything else you'd like to put on the wish list? Okay, let me. No?
Yeah. Sorry, I guess something we're quite interested in at Amnesty is like the crossover between, when we're thinking about our kind of social media engagement strategy, we're treating those people as people, and we focus on the people who are quite new, like it's sort of thought of as like a first entry-level engagement moment with Amnesty. But it would be really interesting to do some interrogation of that, and actually what kind of a crossover there is between the people that are kind of our most vocal and active kind of supporters on social media, and whether or not they're also engaging with us in different ways, which we're doing to a certain extent, but we can only do so much within in-house. It'd be cool if you could do something across lots of organisations. It'd be interesting.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
This is a question, actually, but going on from that, I know you said that your median length of supporters was 8 years or something. Did you disaggregate that at all and look at behaviour of new supporters and more long-standing supporters in terms of which platforms they were using?
So I'll let Sandy answer that, but I think I know what she's going to say.
No, so basically we always controlled for the years that they supported Greenpeace, and there are no changes, no differences in terms of the patterns. So that actually comes back to, I just wanted to add to your comment. So it seems like it's not just, entrance level activity. And what I saw in my research from my PhD as well is that very often these entrance level activities are actually just a different means to get engaged for highly committed users who don't have the time or who are actually not having the opportunity to get active offline. So very much against contesting the whole Slacktivism idea. Yeah.
Because you asked whether that was surprising, for me that was surprising. I mean, I was expecting people who were with Greenpeace for a longer time to be more committed, to be doing more offline. So I was expecting people to be different in that respect.
I only mentioned this because someone mentioned it in a different talk, which was that they were saying that after the first 12 months, people actually doing a civic action, as you call it, had dropped on average to about 28%, which means that about 3/4 of supporters were no longer taking meaningful action. So, and this is very different to what you're suggesting. So I'm just wondering would you do any follow-up in checking? Because I think if someone's been a supporter for a long time, they might be thinking about their most active period and maybe not about their current time. So I'm wondering, would you go back and do some follow-up in showing actual metrics versus perceptions to see whether people are surprised themselves about what they thought they were like in terms of what they do?
Yeah, it would be interesting maybe to compare the metrics from that period when we did the survey with, what people seem to be reporting in our survey. So Thetis. that's for you. Maybe that would be sort of like an interesting way to go about it. Yeah, so for sure. Huh? Any other lingering questions, conclusions? Okay. So we'll thank you for coming to that talk. We hope that was interesting. And of course, we're available throughout the day if you have any questions. And yeah, if you want to connect, please let us know. Thanks.
Thank you.